The moment Lenora Sawyer set the engagement ring down on Gerald Whitmore's mahogany desk and watched his face go slack with disbelief, she understood with perfect clarity that she had never been more alive in her entire 24 years of living. The year was 1882, and the Arizona Territory was not a place where a woman of modest means turned down a proposal from the wealthiest cattle broker in Tucson. Gerald Whitmore owned 3 properties, a carriage with matched bays, and a reputation as a man who got whatever he wanted. He had sandy hair combed flat with pomade, soft hands that had never gripped a fence post or pulled a calf from mud, and eyes that looked at Lenora the way a man looks at a fine piece of furniture he intends to display in his parlor. She had known Gerald for 8 months. She had agreed to the courtship at her mother's gentle insistence and her father's more pointed one. Her father, Thomas Sawyer, was a schoolteacher who had scraped together enough to keep their small house on the eastern edge of town, and the idea of his daughter marrying up into comfort had been the quiet ambition of his later years. Her mother, Clara, had pressed Lenora's best dress the morning Gerald came to call with flowers, and she had watched from behind the kitchen curtain with hopeful eyes. Lenora had tried. She truly had tried to see what everyone else seemed to see in Gerald Whitmore. She tried to find substance behind the tailored vest, some depth beneath the polished manners. But every time she sat across a dinner table from him, she found a man who spoke mostly of his own holdings, who corrected the waiter with a sharpness he hid poorly, who once referred to the Mexican family who worked his land as his property, not his people. He had laughed after saying it as though it were a small joke rather than a revealing truth, and Lenora had felt something cold settle in her chest that no amount of warm parlor light could thaw. She had tried to respect him. That was the honest word for it. Respect. Not passion, not love, not even deep affection. Just a basic and foundational respect for who a man was when no one was watching him perform. She could not find it. And without it, the soft life he offered, the fine house, the servants, the carriage rides on Sunday, the dresses ordered from catalogs felt less like a gift and more like a cage with expensive bars. So she had returned the ring. Gerald's disbelief hardened into something uglier very quickly. He told her she was being foolish and that no woman in her position could afford to be romantic about these matters. She told him calmly that she was not being romantic at all, that this was in fact the most practical decision she had ever made, because a life built on a foundation she did not believe in was no life worth building. He told her she would regret it. She picked up her shawl from the chair, thanked him for the dinners, and walked out into the dry Tucson afternoon with her heart beating fast and free. Her parents did not take the news well. Her father went quiet in the way that meant deep disappointment. Her mother cried. Lenora held Clara's hand and told her she was sorry, but she could not live a lie of a life simply because the lie came with nice furniture. Her mother said she was too stubborn for her own good and too proud for the world as it was. Lenora said she reckoned that was probably true and kissed her mother's cheek and spent the night lying awake staring at the ceiling and thinking about what came next. What came next turned out to be a notice in the Tucson Weekly Citizen. A man up in Calder Creek, a small ranching settlement about 40 miles north in the high desert, was advertising for a schoolteacher. The previous schoolteacher, a Mr. Aldous Finch, had taken ill and returned east, leaving the settlement's 12 children without instruction. The advertisement promised a modest salary, a small private room in the home of the town's postmaster, and the thanks of a community that valued education and was working hard to build something lasting in rough country. Lenora read that advertisement 3 times. She thought about Gerald Whitmore's mahogany desk and his pomaded hair and his voice when he corrected the waiter. Then she thought about 12 children with no one to teach them, and a place nobody had made soft yet, and she wrote her letter of application that same evening. She received a reply within 10 days. It was written in a clear, direct hand, signed by one Margaret Hollies, wife of Postmaster Dale Hollies, who informed Lenora that the position was hers if she could make the journey by the 1st of September. Margaret Hollis wrote that the children were eager, the accommodation was simple but clean, and that Calder Creek was rough around the edges but full of good people who worked hard and meant well. There was a warmth to the letter that Lenora liked. She folded it, placed it in her traveling bag, told her parents she was leaving in 2 weeks, and began to prepare. Her father came around eventually. The night before she left, he sat with her on the porch and told her that she had always been the most determined person he had ever known, and that he was afraid for her and proud of her in equal measure. She leaned against his shoulder the way she had done as a child and told him she would write every week. Her mother packed her a basket with dried biscuits and a small jar of her peach preserves and made her promise to keep her feet dry and her Bible close. Lenora promised both. The journey north was made partly by stage and partly by a hired wagon driven by an old man named Abe Tallworth, who charged fair prices and talked about the weather with the serious dedication of a man who considered it the most important subject in the world. The landscape shifted as they climbed away from Tucson, the flat brown desert giving way to higher desert, pale grass moving in the wind, red rock formations rising on the horizon like the ruins of something ancient and enormous. The sky was the kind of blue that seems impossible, too saturated to be real, and it went on forever in every direction. Lenora sat on the wagon bench beside old Abe with her bag between her feet and watched the country open up around her, and felt something in her chest that she could only call rightness. Calder Creek was smaller than she had imagined. It had one main street, a combination general store and post office, a livery stable, a church that doubled as a community hall, a saloon called the Dusty Crown that was rougher in appearance than the church, but perhaps more frequently attended, and perhaps 30 buildings in various states of construction and occupation scattered along the creek's edge and up the gentle slope above it. The creek itself was narrow and brown with recent rain, but alive with cottonwood trees that turned the air green and moving in a way that reminded Lenora of water even when you could not see it. Margaret Hollis was a sturdy woman in her 40s with red-brown hair going gray at the temples and a handshake that could have belonged to a carpenter. She met the wagon at the edge of town as though she had been watching for it, and she looked Lenora over once with the frank, appraising look of a person who did not waste time on pretense, and then she smiled and said, "Good. You look like someone who does not frighten easily." Lenora said she hoped that was still true by the end of the first week. Margaret laughed loudly and took her bag and led her to the small room behind the post office, which was indeed simple and indeed clean, with a narrow bed and a washstand and a window that looked out over the creek and the cottonwoods. Lenora set her traveling bag on the bed and looked out that window for a long moment and thought, "Yes, this is where I am supposed to be." The schoolhouse was a single room built onto the back of the church, with 8 mismatched desks, a chalkboard that had clearly been salvaged from somewhere else, and a wood stove that Margaret told her could be temperamental in wet weather. Lenora spent her first 2 days organizing the space, taking inventory of the reading primers and arithmetic slates that had been donated by various families, and walking around the settlement to introduce herself. The people of Calder Creek received her with varying degrees of warmth. Some families were clearly grateful and brought her small welcome gifts: a jar of honey from the Maddox family, a length of good ribbon from the general store owner's wife, a dozen eggs from old Pete Rucker, who raised chickens at the south end of town. Others were more reserved, watching her with the careful eyes of people who had seen outsiders come and go and learned not to invest too quickly. It was on her 3rd day, while she was standing at the chalkboard working out how to divide the children into reading groups by skill rather than age, that she first became aware of Henry Keating. She heard him before she saw him. The schoolhouse door was propped open against the September heat, and there were voices outside, 2 men talking with the particular back-and-forth ease of people who knew each other well. Then one voice said something that made the other laugh. A real laugh, not the polished social kind, but the genuine helpless kind that comes up from somewhere deeper. Lenora found herself turning toward the door despite herself. Henry Keating was standing in the churchyard talking to Dale Hollies, and the first thing Lenora noticed about him was that he was entirely in the landscape rather than standing against it. He was tall but not imposing, rangy in the way of men who did physical work consistently rather than occasionally, with dark hair that needed cutting and a face that had been given texture by sun and wind, and whatever weather came before that. He was dressed in the practical way of a working rancher: worn boots, canvas trousers, a collarless shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, and he was holding his hat in one hand and gesturing with the other as he made whatever point had produced the laugh from Dale. Then he glanced through the open schoolhouse door and saw her. Lenora did not look away quickly. She was not in the habit of pretending she had not been looking when she clearly had. She held his gaze for a beat, acknowledged it with a small nod, and returned to the chalkboard. She heard Dale Hollies' voice a moment later. "That's Miss Sawyer, our new school teacher. Just arrived from Tucson." A pause. Then the other voice, which was lower and more careful than it had been in the easy laughter of a moment before. "I'll be going in to say hello, if that's not an interruption." She heard boots on the wooden steps and turned again. He filled the doorway without meaning to, purely because of his height, and he dipped his head slightly as he came through, as though he had learned long ago to account for the dimension. He turned his hat in his hands once and looked around the schoolroom with what appeared to be genuine interest before his eyes came back to her. "Miss Sawyer," he said, "I'm Henry Keating. I have the Keating Ranch about 3 miles east of here. My nephew Charlie is one of your students. I wanted to come in and thank you for taking the position, because I happen to think education is the most important thing these children can receive, and I've been concerned since Mr. Finch left." His speech was not rough exactly, but it was plain-spoken, without the ornamentation that men of Gerald Whitmore's class added to every sentence as a kind of decoration. He meant what he said, and he said what he meant, and he said it directly. Lenora said, "I appreciate the welcome, Mr. Keating. Tell me about Charlie." Something in his expression shifted slightly, a kind of appreciation for the practical direction, and he sat down in one of the student chairs as though it had not occurred to him to do otherwise, which made her like him a degree more because it meant he was not performing dignity. He told her about Charlie Keating, who was 9 years old and the son of Henry's late brother Daniel, who had died of a fever 2 winters ago, leaving Charlie and his mother, Ruth, in Henry's care. Charlie was bright but had fallen behind in his reading because the terms at the schoolhouse had been interrupted, first by Mr. Finch's illness and then by his departure, and what Charlie needed most was someone who would not let him get away with pretending he didn't understand when in fact he was simply not trying. Lenora said she was familiar with that particular strategy in 9-year-old boys. Henry said that Charlie employed it with considerable skill, and there was a quiet warmth in his voice when he spoke of his nephew that told her something meaningful about who he was. She asked about the other students. He knew every one of them by name and family, knew their particular difficulties and strengths, knew which ones walked the farthest to school, and which families were struggling that season and might have children who came in hungry. He talked about the community with the deep knowledge of a man who had been there long enough to understand it rather than simply observe it, and Lenora found herself leaning against the front desk with her arms folded and listening with more attention than she usually gave to a first conversation. When he stood to leave 20 minutes later, hat back on his head, he paused at the door and said, "Miss Sawyer, if there is anything the ranch can provide for the schoolhouse, I have lumber and I have labor, and I mean that genuinely." She told him she would keep that in mind. He nodded once and left. She stood in the quiet schoolroom for a moment and listened to his boots on the churchyard path fading away, and then she turned back to the chalkboard and wrote the first reading group assignments, and told herself firmly that she was here to teach children and build a life, not to notice the quality of a man's laugh through an open door. School began the following Monday, and it was glorious chaos of exactly the kind Lenora had anticipated. 12 children ranging from age 5 to age 13 arrived in varying states of readiness, from young Clara Maddox, who could already read simple sentences and arrived with her slate already pulled from her bag, to the Rucker boys, twins of 11 named Sam and Eli, who arrived in what appeared to be an ongoing physical dispute and did not cease it simply because they had entered a schoolroom. Lenora managed the twins with the same calm tone and complete lack of alarm that she brought to most difficulties, and by mid-morning they had settled into something resembling productive discontent, which she considered a success for day one. Charlie Keating arrived with a new slate and a serious expression that she recognized immediately as the face of a child preparing to be difficult. He was small for 9, dark-haired like his uncle, with sharp eyes that moved around the room assessing things before he had even sat down. Lenora gave him the reading assessment she gave all the children and watched him deliberately stumble over words she was fairly certain he knew, and afterward she pulled him aside while the others worked on arithmetic and said, very quietly, "I know you can read better than that, Charlie. So does your uncle. So why don't we stop wasting each other's time?" Charlie stared at her for a long moment with his uncle's assessing eyes in his child's face, and then he said, "Mr. Finch used to let me skip ahead if I said I didn't understand the lesson." Lenora said, "I'm not Mr. Finch." Charlie appeared to consider this with genuine care, and then something settled behind his eyes and he nodded once, which was remarkably adult for 9, and went back to his seat and did not pretend again for the rest of the day. Henry Keating came by after school on Friday of that first week, ostensibly to collect Charlie, but also, Lenora suspected, to see how the week had gone. She was at the chalkboard, erasing the week's arithmetic problems when she heard the door, and turned to find him standing in the same doorway with the same instinctive duck of the head, and she found it no less remarkable the second time than the first. She told him Charlie had turned a corner by Wednesday and was reading at the level she expected for a child his age. Henry's face did something quiet and grateful that was more moving than any elaborate expression she had seen in a dinner party in Tucson. He said, "How did you manage it?" She said, "I just told him the truth." He said, "That's usually the only thing that actually works in my experience." Charlie appeared from behind Henry with a piece of chalk dust on his nose, said good afternoon to Miss Sawyer in the careful way of a child who has learned a new social formality and is trying it on, and Henry pressed his hand briefly to the back of Charlie's head with an unthinking tenderness that Lenora caught and tucked away somewhere she did not examine too closely. The weeks turned. September became October, and the desert cooled into the sharp, dry air that made the mornings brilliant and the evenings cold. Lenora settled into Calder Creek the way she settled into most things, thoroughly, without performance, paying attention to the particular texture of the place. She learned which families were proud and needed to be approached sideways, and which ones were simply busy and needed things said plainly. She organized a small lending library using donated books and a shelf that Henry Keating built and delivered one afternoon without ceremony, carrying the timber planks in himself, and leaving Margaret Hollies to direct where they went while he worked in companionable quiet. Lenora graded papers at the desk while he worked, and they talked intermittently. About the books she planned to put on the shelf, about a rainstorm that was coming down from the north, about a piece in the Arizona Weekly she had read and disagreed with on the subject of whether the territory should pursue statehood. Henry had opinions on statehood that were specific and well-reasoned, and Lenora found herself arguing back with genuine pleasure, the way she rarely had in Tucson, where most men in her acquaintance found her opinions on public affairs somewhere between amusing and uncomfortable. Henry did not find them uncomfortable. He pushed back where he disagreed and conceded where she made a point he could not answer, and when she made a particularly good argument about the economic consequences of territorial status versus statehood, he sat back against the wall and looked at her with that same assessing quality his nephew had and said, "Where did you learn to argue like that?" she said. "My father is a schoolteacher. We argued at the dinner table every night." He said, "He must be very proud of you." She said, "He was mostly terrified when I came out here." Henry said, "That's not the same as not being proud." She looked at him. He looked back. Outside the window, the cottonwood leaves were going gold, and the creek whispered over its stones. And inside the schoolroom, it was warm from the stove Henry had fixed that morning because it had been behaving badly in the cool weather, and Lenora thought, careful. The town's social life was modest but present. There were dances held in the church on the second Saturday of each month, organized by Margaret Hollies, with the efficiency she brought to most things. And Lenora attended the October dance and discovered that Calder Creek had its own rhythms and pleasures that had nothing to do with the polished entertainments of Tucson. A man named Cord Yates played fiddle with extraordinary skill and somewhat erratic sobriety, and a woman named Rosa Hernandez, who ran the laundry at the south end of town with her mother, played a guitar with a deep rhythmic authority that made the floor feel alive. People danced with genuine joy and no particular technique, and children ran between adult legs until they fell asleep on the pews pushed to the edges of the room. Henry Keating arrived at the October dance late, having come directly from the ranch, and he caught Lenora's eye across the room with the direct way he had of doing most things, and crossed to where she stood with Margaret near the refreshment table. He asked her to dance. She said yes. He was a better dancer than she expected, not elegant exactly, but capable and attentive in a way that made dancing with him easy. He led clearly, which she appreciated, and he paid attention to the space and the other couples, which she also appreciated. And when he guided her around a near collision with the Rucker twins attempting some sort of jig in the middle of the floor, his hand at her back was steady and warm and entirely aware of itself. They danced twice and then found a corner where they could talk over the noise of the fiddle, and he told her about the ranch and the particular challenges of the current season. It had been dry that summer, and the cattle were not as fat as he had hoped, and winter in the high desert could be unpredictable and sometimes brutal. He told her these things without complaint, with the matter-of-fact quality of a man who had made his choices and lived inside them honestly. She told him about a letter from her mother describing Gerald Whitmore's engagement to a young woman from Phoenix which had arrived that week, and the way her mother had written it with a careful neutrality that was itself a kind of message. Henry said, "Is that difficult?" She considered the question honestly. "No," she said, "which is perhaps the clearest possible evidence that I made the right choice." He said, "I heard something about a man in Tucson when I heard you were coming." "Margaret knows everything that comes through the post." Lenora laughed despite herself. "I imagine she does." He said, "I don't know the details and I'm not asking for them. But I wanted to say, whatever made you choose this instead of that, I'm glad you did, for the children's sake." She looked at him sideways and said, "Only for the children's sake." He held her gaze a beat and then something moved through his expression, cautious and warm at the same time, and he said, "For several reasons. I listed the easiest one first." The dance ended and they returned to the room and were pulled in separate directions by the natural currents of a small community social evening, and Lenora stood later with Rosa Hernandez, listening to her describe the difficulties of running a business in Calder Creek as a Mexican woman, the small daily indignities, the customers who expected more for less, the way certain men in town spoke to her that they would never speak to Lenora or Margaret. Lenora listened carefully and asked questions, and did not offer empty reassurances, because she had learned long ago that empty reassurances were a kind of dishonesty dressed up as kindness. She asked Rosa if she had ever thought about adding a sewing service to the laundry, because she had seen a gap in what the town could offer, and Rosa's eyes lit up with the particular light of someone who has had the same idea and never heard anyone else acknowledge it as viable. They talked for an hour. By the end of it, they had the beginning of a genuine friendship, which Lenora found herself treasuring alongside the cotton-wool quality of the night air coming in under the church doors. Walking back to the post office afterward under a sky exploding with stars, the high desert sky at night, was one of the things she had not anticipated. So dense with light it felt like something you could reach into. She found herself feeling something she could only call fullness. Not the fullness of having everything arranged and decided and secured. The fullness of being exactly where you were supposed to be, doing exactly what you were supposed to do, with the right things still ahead of you rather than behind. October deepened. On a Tuesday in the third week of the month, a situation arose that Lenora had been peripherally aware of but had not yet had to address directly. Thomas Aldridge, who owned the general store and was on the town's informal council, came to the schoolhouse after class and told her with the expression of a man who expects to be disagreed with that he had heard. She was spending extra time with the Hernandez children, 8-year-old Pilar and 10-year-old Marco, and that some families had expressed concern about the time their own children might be losing as a result. Lenora looked at him for a moment and then asked him to be more direct about what the concern actually was. He was not direct about it, but she understood what he was not saying. The Hernandez children were the only Mexican children in the school, and some families had not been entirely comfortable with them from the start. She told Thomas Aldridge clearly and without heat that she taught every child in that school with equal investment, that Pilar and Marco were hardworking students who were navigating lessons in their second language with impressive determination, and that any parent who wanted to discuss the matter with her directly was welcome to come in. She also told him that she had a duty to those 12 children regardless of who their parents were or what language they spoke at home, and that duty was not negotiable. Thomas Aldridge left looking uncertain, which was not the same as having changed his mind, but it was something. The following day Henry Keating came to the schoolhouse. He came during the school day this time, waited outside until the lunch break when children scattered into the churchyard to eat, and then knocked on the open door. She waved him in. He sat in the chair that had become something like his chair through repetition, and said he had heard about the conversation with Thomas Aldridge. She said, "Is there something you want to add to it?" He said, "I want to say that I think you handled it correctly and I want to say it to your face, not through the gossip chain." She looked at him. "Do you have a stake in this beyond principle?" he said. "My ranch hand for the past 4 years is a man named Santiago Reyes. He is the best horseman I have ever seen and one of the most decent people I know, and he and his family have been treated like guests who have overstayed by half the people in this town their whole lives, and I am tired of it. So no, it's not only principle, it's personal." Lenora said, "I appreciate that." He said, "I told Aldridge myself this morning that if he came back to you with that conversation again, he could find somewhere else to buy his fence supplies." She said, "You didn't have to do that." He said, "I know I didn't have to." "That's different from not needing to do it." She looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the children's voices rose and fell in the churchyard, and a crow complained from the cottonwood by the creek, and the afternoon light came through the schoolhouse window at the low autumn angle that turned everything the color of honey. She said, "Henry." It was the first time she had used his given name directly. She had not planned it. He noticed it, she could tell by the small stillness that came over him. She said, "Why do you keep coming by?" He turned his hat in his hands once. He said, "Because I find reasons to." She said, "That's an honest answer." He said, "I try." She said, "So do I," and held his gaze, and let that sit between them without covering it over with additional words. He left before the children came back in, and she stood in the warm honey light of the schoolroom and pressed her fingers briefly to the worn wood of the front desk, and felt her heart beating in a way that was entirely inconvenient and entirely wonderful. November brought cold. The first hard frost came on the 5th, turning the creek's edges to lace and silvering the cottonwood branches. Margaret lit the post office stove earlier each morning, and Lenora developed the habit of coming to breakfast before the children arrived, and she and Margaret would sit with their coffee, and the mornings quiet and talk about the town and its people, and the thousand small things that made up a life. Margaret told her about Henry Keating without being asked. She did it the way women of her practical type share important information directly and without embellishment. She said that Henry had come to Calder Creek 6 years ago from Colorado, where he had worked on cattle drives and then saved enough to put a deposit on land. She said he had built the Keating Ranch from nothing, which was mostly true. He had bought 40 acres of high desert grass and rock, and built his house and his barn with his own hands and those of 2 hired men, and expanded it over years to what it was now. She said he had taken in his nephew Charlie without hesitation after his brother Daniel died, and that Charlie's mother Ruth had stayed on the ranch, and was a good steady woman who appreciated what Henry had given up to keep the family together. Lenora asked, "Has he ever come close to marrying?" Margaret said, "There was a woman in his 2nd year here, a widow named Frances Cole who had a farm to the south. She wanted to combine the operations. He was genuinely fond of her, but he told her he couldn't marry someone he was only fond of, and she told him he had impossible standards, and she sold the farm and moved to Flagstaff." Margaret paused. "He was not wrong, in my opinion. Fond is not enough for a life." Lenora said, "No, it is not." They looked at each other over their coffee cups with the mutual understanding of women who have thought about these things seriously. Margaret said, "He looks at you the way a man looks at something he is afraid to want." Lenora said, "I know," Margaret said. "Don't make him wait too long. He is patient, but patience has a limit even in good men." She thought about that on the walk to the schoolhouse through the frost-bright morning, and she thought about it through the school day, watching Pilar Hernandez master a long division problem with the fierce satisfaction of a child who has worked hard for something, watching Charlie Keating read aloud from a passage in the primer with a fluency that 3 weeks ago he had hidden behind performance, watching Sam and Eli Rucker argue about the correct answer to an arithmetic problem in the productive way of boys who actually care about getting it right. She thought, this is a life. This particular texture of days, the cold mornings and the warm schoolroom and the children and the community and the hard work of building something. This is a life I chose, and it is already remarkable, and it could be more remarkable still. On a Friday evening in mid-November, she walked out to the Keating Ranch. She told Margaret she was taking a walk east, and Margaret said nothing except that she should take a lantern because the sun set early now. The walk was 3 miles on the wagon road that wound through the high grass and around the base of a red rock formation that the people of Calder Creek called the Thumb, and the air was cold and clean and smelled of juniper from the scrubland to the north. She walked with her shawl pulled close and the lantern swinging, and the stars beginning to appear above the Thumb in the pale eastern sky. She heard the ranch before she saw it, horses in the corral, and the sound of men's voices, and the clang of something metal, and then the warm yellow rectangles of lit windows through the dark, and the shape of the barn and the house, and the smaller bunkhouse structure against the deep blue of the evening sky. Henry was in the corral working with a young horse, a bay filly that was objecting to the hackamore with the indignant energy of something young and strong that has not yet learned patience. He had his back to her at first, moving around the filly's near side with the slow, deliberate movements of a man who knows that calmness is the only tool that works. Santiago Reyes sat on the top fence rail watching with the concentrated interest of a man who loves horses. Santiago saw her first and said something in a low voice to Henry, who turned. He saw her standing at the fence gate with the lantern, and the cold turning her breath to small clouds, and something moved through his face, surprise first, then a warmth so unmistakable that she felt it from 10 yards away. He came to the gate and opened it, and she came through and said, "I hope I'm not interrupting." He said, "You are absolutely interrupting. Come in." She laughed and he laughed, and Santiago Reyes nodded his greeting and took the bay filly's lead rope to give them the corral. They walked to the fence at the far side of the corral and leaned on it side by side, looking out at the dark desert and the rising stars, and she said, "I wanted to tell you something." He said, "All right," she said. "I came out to this place because I needed to choose something for myself, something that was mine, built by my hands and my choices. I turned down a man who would have given me a comfortable life because something in it would have been wrong from the first stone, and I am standing here in the cold in November having chosen this instead, and I want you to know that I do not regret it." He said quietly, "I know you don't." She said, "But I want you to know that what I am not regretting includes considerably having met you." A silence. The horse moved in the corral behind them. The stars came out thick and brilliant overhead. He said, "Lenora." She said, "Yes." He said, "I think you are the most remarkable person to come through this territory in the 6 years I have been here. And I do not say that to flatter you. I say it because it is the truest sentence I have put together in some time." She turned and looked at him. His face in the lantern light was open in a way she had not seen before, the careful reserve gone, and underneath it was something quiet and sure and serious and warm. She said, "Remarkable is a good word." He said, "It's the right one." She said, "Henry, are you going to say what you want to say, or are we going to stand at this fence all night being careful?" He turned toward her fully. He said, "I would like to spend time with you, proper time, not just finding reasons to come by the schoolhouse. I would like to come by with the honest reason and stop pretending there's another one." She said, "Then come by with the honest reason." He reached out and took her hand, which was cold from the walk, and held it in both of his, which were warm from the work, and they stood at the fence under the extraordinary sky and said nothing else for a good long while, and did not need to. He walked her back to Calder Creek with the lantern between them and the dark desert alive with night sounds, coyotes somewhere to the west, an owl in the cottonwoods by the creek as they came back into the settlement's edge. At the post office door he stopped and said, "I'll come by Sunday, with the honest reason." She said, "I'll be here." He said, "Good night, Lenora." She said, "Good night, Henry," and went inside and stood in her small room with its window on the creek and felt that full feeling again, fuller this time, fuller than she had ever felt it. And she sat on the edge of the bed and pressed her hands together and closed her eyes and thought, yes, this, exactly this. He came Sunday with a jar of honey from the ranch's hives and 2 good horses saddled, and they rode out into the desert together for 3 hours, talking the whole way. She had not ridden regularly since childhood, but she had the instinct for it, and Henry watched her find her seat on the mare he had brought for her with the quiet appreciation of someone who notices competence. They rode up onto a flat mesa that looked out over the whole of the Calder Creek Valley below, the settlement small and definite against the vast open country, and the mountains to the north going purple in the afternoon light. He told her about Colorado, about the cattle drives he had done as a younger man, the months-long journeys up through the territory before the railroads changed everything, the way the land looked from horseback at the pace of cattle moving, which was different from any other pace. He told her about his brother Daniel, who had been younger and different from him in temperament, warmer and quicker to laugh and less inclined to solitude, and how much he missed him still, especially in the moments when Charlie did something that was purely Daniel's gesture or expression come back. She told him about Tucson and her father's school, and her own years of watching her parents' quiet partnership and understanding from that what she wanted and did not want from a marriage. He asked, "What do you want from it?" She thought for a moment. She said, "A partner, not a keeper and not a passenger, someone who sees me and doesn't want to change what they see. Someone I can respect completely." He said, "That seems like a sensible list." She said, "Gerald Whitmore thought it was unrealistic." Henry said, "Gerald Whitmore sounds like a man who was most concerned with what things looked like." She said, "That is precisely right." He said, "Then he was always the wrong choice." She looked at him. "Yes," she said, "he always was." They rode back down into the valley as the sun moved west and the shadow of the mesa lengthened across the desert floor. And they came back into Calder Creek in the early evening, with the horses blowing steam in the cold air. And Henry saw her to the post office door, and held her horse while she dismounted, and did not linger beyond what was appropriate for a first Sunday. But when he left, he looked back once from the road, and she was still in the doorway, and they looked at each other across the November dark with something between them that was already inevitable. December arrived with a cold that was serious this time, the kind that came down out of the north with teeth in it, and snow fell twice in the first week, light and dry and gone by afternoon, but enough to whiten the world for a few hours and make the children absolutely wild with the particular madness of desert children who rarely see snow. Lenora let the younger ones out early on the first snow day to run in the churchyard, which was not in the curriculum but which she decided to count as a lesson in something important she had not yet named. Henry's visits became regular and needed no pretense. He came on Sundays without fail, and sometimes on Wednesday evenings after the ranch work was done, and he and Lenora sat in the post office kitchen with Margaret and Dale Hollies if they were about, or alone by the parlor stove if they were not, talking about everything and nothing with the accumulating depth of two people learning each other thoroughly. He brought Charlie sometimes on Sundays, and Charlie thawed toward Lenora entirely over these weeks, the way children thaw when they understand that the adult in question is consistent, that the kindness is not performance. On a Sunday in mid-December, Charlie fell asleep on the parlor rug with his head on his arm and his slate chalk still in his hand, having apparently done additional schoolwork voluntarily, which Lenora considered one of the finest professional compliments of her career. She and Henry sat across from each other in the parlor chairs with the stove going between them and the boy asleep on the rug and the lamplight warm on everything, and there was a domesticity to the scene that neither of them remarked on but both of them felt, and she thought, "This is what it looks like." Henry said, quietly, watching Charlie sleep, "He talks about you, you know, at home. Quotes things you've said as though they're from the Bible." She said, "That is a significant responsibility." He said, "You're handling it well." She said, "He is a remarkable child." Henry looked at her. "You used that word." She said, "You started it." He said, "I did." He paused, then, "Lenora, I want to ask you something." She said, "Ask." He said, "I know you have only been here 3 months. I know the proper thing is to wait longer and be more careful. But I have never been good at pretending I don't know what I know, and I know that what I feel for you is not going to change with more time. It is only going to be more certain." She said, "Go on." He said, "I'm not offering you easy or comfortable. The ranch is hard work and the winters out here are real, and the life I can give you is built from the ground up and is not finished being built. I know that. I'm not going to tell you otherwise." She said, "I know you're not." He said, "But I want to build it with you if you will let me. I want to marry you, Lenora, if you want that too." The stove ticked quietly. Charlie breathed slow and even on the rug. Outside the window, the December night pressed close and cold and brilliant with stars. She said, "Henry, I walked away from a comfortable life with a man I could not respect. I walked toward the harder thing because the harder thing was honest. I'm already living the life I chose, and I want you in it. I want to build it with you." She paused. "Yes." He reached across the space between the chairs and took her hand, the same as he had at the fence in November, but different now, something confirmed and permanent in it. He said, "Yes." She said, "Yes." Charlie stirred on the rug and opened one eye and looked at them with his hand under his cheek, and then appeared to decide that whatever was happening was satisfactory, because he closed his eye again and went back to sleep. Lenora laughed quietly into her free hand, and Henry laughed too, and in the warm lamplit room of the Calder Creek post office in the December of 1882, they sat together and let the future take shape between them, solid and real and entirely their own making. The engagement was not a secret for long in a town as small as Calder Creek. Margaret Hollies was the first to know, and she received the news with a decisive nod and the practical question of whether they had thought about the date, because the church calendar filled up fast in spring, and they would want to speak to the Reverend early. Henry's sister-in-law Ruth came to town 2 days after hearing and embraced Lenora with the uncomplicated warmth of someone who had been hoping for exactly this, and told her that Henry was the best man she knew and that this was an enormous relief. Lenora told her that she was in complete agreement, which made Ruth laugh. Letters went to Tucson. Her father's reply came back in 10 days, written in his schoolteacher's careful hand, and it said that he was happy for her and that he had known from the way she described the place and the work and the people that something important was taking root there, and that he hoped Mr. Keating understood what a remarkable woman he was getting. Her mother's letter arrived 3 days later and was mostly concerned with the question of the dress and whether Lenora had the appropriate materials and could Margaret Holly sew, because Clara had a pattern she had been keeping for just such an occasion and would send it on the next stage. Lenora wrote back that Margaret Holly's could indeed sew, and that she should send the pattern, and that she was happier than she had known it was possible to be in this particular way. The Christmas of 1882 was the first Christmas Lenora spent away from her parents' house, and it was also, she thought, the best one of her adult life. The community gathered in the church on Christmas Eve, and Cord Yates played his fiddle with more sobriety than usual in deference to the occasion, and Rosa Hernandez sang a Christmas song in Spanish that she had learned from her grandmother, and the children performed a brief and somewhat chaotic tableau that Miss Sawyer had prepared with them over the preceding 2 weeks. Charlie Keating's contribution to the tableau involved being a shepherd, which he did with great dignity, until Eli Rucker accidentally knocked over the wooden manger, and the resulting crash sent both Rucker twins into helpless laughter that proved highly contagious. Lenora watched from the side of the room and felt her heart so full of the particular mix of love and exasperation that was the daily texture of teaching that she thought it might simply overflow. Henry stood beside her for the tableau and afterward, and through the community supper that followed, and when the evening wound down and people went home through the cold starlit night, he walked her back to the post office, and they stood at the door in the cold, and he kissed her for the first time, which was everything she had expected it to be and then more, warm and certain and thorough. And when it was done, she kept her eyes closed for a moment before she opened them and found him watching her with the expression she had come to know best, the one that was the undisguised version, all the careful reserve gone, just him looking at her. She said, "Merry Christmas, Henry." He said, "Merry Christmas, Lenora," and pressed his forehead briefly to hers and then stepped back into the night. January was hard. The cold came down in earnest, and the high desert showed what it could do when it meant business. There were 3 days in the second week when the temperature did not rise above freezing even at midday, and a snowstorm in the third week that closed the schoolhouse for 2 days and buried the water trough at the livery under 2 feet of drifted white. Lenora used the closed school days to plan the spring term and to walk over to the Hernandez house and spend the afternoon helping Rosa with a sewing project she had taken on. 2 shirts for Thomas Aldridge's boy who had outgrown his current ones. And the conversation they had was honest and varied, and included Rosa's observations about the town's complicated attitudes and Lenora's thoughts about what small communities could become when the people in them chose to do better. Rosa said, "You are not going to leave, are you, after you marry?" Lenora said, "Why would I leave? The school is here." Rosa said, "Some women stop teaching when they marry." Lenora said, "I am not some women." Rosa smiled at her needle. "No," she said, "you are not." Henry came through the storm on the second day of it to bring firewood to the post office because he had seen that the pile at the side of the building was getting low. He arrived covered in snow and with the air of a man who had not considered not coming, and Dale Hollies gave him a whiskey to warm him, and they all sat around the kitchen stove while the storm blew outside and talked about the spring, and what Henry planned to expand at the ranch, and how the school lending library was being used, and whether Calder Creek might be large enough to sustain a small newspaper in the coming years. Lenora watched Henry talk with Dale about cattle prices and range management, and felt the particular pleasure of watching a person she loved do the thing they were made for, which in Henry's case was being part of something, invested in the place and the people and the future of it all. He was not a man who held himself apart. He belonged to Calder Creek in the way the creek and the cottonwoods and the red rock formations belonged to it. He was part of the landscape of the place, grown into it over 6 years of honest work. She thought about the life she had turned down. She thought about Gerald Whitmore's mahogany desk and his pomaded hair and his voice when he said the word property and meant people. She thought about what she would be doing at this exact moment if she had said yes to that ring. She would be in a warm parlor in Tucson with a fire that someone else had lit, and a supper that someone else had made, and a husband who saw her as part of a carefully arranged picture. The thought produced in her the same thing it had produced when she returned the ring, the simple, certain knowledge that it was wrong for her, and gratitude so deep it was almost physical that she had known it in time. She reached under the table and squeezed Henry's hand briefly. He looked at her, surprised, and then not surprised, and his fingers closed around hers for a moment before the conversation pulled his attention back and she let go, and the storm blew outside and the stove ticked, and she was completely where she wanted to be. February came with a particular event that shifted things. A man named Declan Brand rode into Calder Creek on a Tuesday morning, with the look of someone who had been traveling for days, and the manner of someone who was not accustomed to announcing his purposes. He put his horse in the livery, came into the general store, and spent the day asking questions about the town and its people, and its land with a casualness that was slightly too casual. By evening, 3 separate people had remarked to Henry or Dale or Thomas Aldridge that there was something off about the new arrival. Henry came to the post office that evening and told Lenora what he had heard, which was that Declan Brand had been asking specifically about the water rights along the upper creek and about which ranches relied on the creek for their water supply. This was not innocent curiosity. There was a pattern of land speculation in the territory that Henry had seen before in Colorado. Men came in, identified water access as the leverage, and tried to buy or claim it before the existing residents understood what was happening. Without the creek, several ranches, including Henry's, would have a serious problem on their hands. Henry said, "I don't want to alarm people, but I want them to know." He and Dale called an informal meeting in the church the following evening. About 20 people came, including Thomas Aldridge, who came with his usual expression of uncertainty, and left with a clearer understanding of why he should be concerned regardless of his reservations about other matters. Declan Brand was not invited, and was presumably in the Dusty Crown, unaware of the meeting. What emerged from the meeting was a practical plan. They would check the land records, which were held at the county seat in Florence, to confirm that the water rights along the upper creek were already documented and held, and they would do it quickly. Henry volunteered to make the 2-day ride to Florence himself. Dale said he would come along because the postmaster often had standing to request records. Henry came to Lenora the next morning before he left and told her he would be gone 3 days at most. She said she understood and told him to be careful on the road. He said he would be, she said, and Henry, find what you need to find. He said, "That's the plan." He left with Dale at first light, and Lenora taught her school day, and then sat with Margaret in the evening, and did not show the worry she felt, because worry without action is only noise, and there was nothing to be done but wait. Declan Brand made himself known at the schoolhouse on the 2nd day. He came in at the lunch hour when the children were outside and introduced himself with an ease that was meant to be charming and landed as practiced. He told her he was a land agent from Flagstaff and was interested in certain properties in the Calder Creek area, and asked whether she had been in the settlement long. She told him she was the school teacher and had been here since September. He asked if she knew Henry Keating. She said Henry was a friend of hers. He said that was excellent and that she might be able to help Mr. Keating understand a very good opportunity regarding the creek land. Lenora looked at him calmly and said, "Mr. Brand, the people of this settlement have been here for years, building their ranches and their homes. The water rights along this creek are not an opportunity for outside interests. They are the foundation of people's lives. I think you should be very careful about how you proceed." He looked at her for a moment with the recalibration of a man who had expected a different response. And then he smiled the way men do when they have decided to dismiss what they have just heard, and said he appreciated her candor and left. She watched him go and felt the particular cold anger of someone who has seen this pattern before in a different form. The soft-voiced man who wants something and expects to get it because he has always gotten it. She thought of Gerald Whitmore and his mahogany desk, and the way certain men moved through the world expecting it to arrange itself around them, and she felt the anger settle into something harder and steadier, and she went back into the schoolroom and rang the bell to call the children in from lunch. Henry came back on the third day with Dale and with the information they needed. The water rights along the upper creek had been registered by the original settlers of Calder Creek in 1876, which predated any legitimate claim from outside, and the records were clear. Dale had copies made. Henry presented the information to the informal council the same evening he returned, and Thomas Aldridge, who had done some digging of his own in Henry's absence, and discovered that Declan Brand had a complicated history with land deals in 2 other Arizona Territory settlements, added his voice firmly to the resolution that Brand would be informed his interest in Calder Creek was not welcome. The resolution was delivered to Brand the following morning by Henry and Dale and Thomas Aldridge together, plainly and without spectacle. Brand left Calder Creek by noon. The crisis, such as it was, had lasted 6 days and ended cleanly, but it had done something to the community's sense of itself, a kind of confirmation that they were capable of protecting what they had built, that the settlement was not simply a collection of individual claims but a community with the will to act together. Henry came to the post office that evening and Lenora was in the parlor with her marking, and he sat across from her and put his hat on his knee and said, "That's done," she said. "I know. Rosa told me an hour ago," he said. "I heard you spoke to Brand when he came to the schoolhouse." She said, "He thought he could make an ally of me." Henry said, "What did you tell him?" She repeated what she had said plainly. He listened with the specific quality of attention he gave to things that mattered to him, full and present, and when she finished he looked at her with that expression she knew. He said, "You never stop remarkabling me." She said, "Is that a verb now?" He said, "It is now." She laughed and he laughed, and the marking was set aside, and they talked for 2 hours about everything and nothing. And when he left that night, he kissed her at the door, and she held onto the front of his coat for a moment before letting go, and he said, "April cannot come fast enough." She said, "No, it cannot." They had decided on the first Saturday in April for the wedding. Not because of convention, but because the desert in early April was the most beautiful it would be all year. The winter cold gone and the summer heat not yet arrived. The land briefly and improbably lush with the brief bloom that the winter rains produced. And Lenora had walked out onto the mesa above the settlement one Sunday in late October and looked at the valley below and thought, "I want to be married here when it looks like this." March came. Her parents arrived on the 5th day of the month on the stage from Tucson. Her mother already in mild tears from the emotion of the journey, and her father, with the contained expression of a man determined to take everything in before he said what he thought. Henry met them at the stage with Lenora and shook Thomas Sawyer's hand firmly, and received Clara's more emotional greeting, with a warmth and patience that Lenora noted with deep appreciation. And her father walked alongside Henry the 2 blocks to the post office, asking him questions about the ranch and the territory with the manner of a man doing quiet due diligence. And Henry answered everyone directly. That evening at supper, with Margaret Hollies's excellent cooking on the table and Dale at the head, and Charlie included as honorary family, and making his most careful dinner table manners. Thomas Sawyer raised his glass and said, "I want to say to Mr. Keating that my daughter is the finest, most determined and most honest person I know, and that if he takes her in the spirit in which she presents herself, without pretense, without compromise, with everything she has, he will have a partner beyond measure." Henry said without hesitation, "I know I will, Mr. Sawyer. I knew it before she had been here a week," Clara cried. Charlie asked if people always cried at nice things because it seemed inefficient. Margaret told him it was an important part of nice things, and that he would understand when he was older. Charlie considered this and appeared unconvinced but accepting. Thomas Sawyer looked at Lenora across the table, and she saw in his face everything he could not say plainly, all the pride and the relief and the love of it, and she met his eyes and smiled at him and understood. The first Saturday in April came clear and gold, and exactly as she had imagined. The desert was in its brief wild bloom, the scrubland dotted with tiny flowers of yellow and purple and white, and the cottonwoods by the creek were fully leafed out in the brilliant new green of spring, and the sky was that impossible blue going on forever. The ceremony was in the churchyard rather than inside the church, because it was too beautiful a day to be indoors. Reverend Moss, who had presided over Calder Creek's spiritual and civic life for 4 years with equal parts solemnity and good humor, stood under the cottonwood with his Bible and the morning light, and the whole of the settlement came. Every family. Rosa Hernandez in her best dress with her mother and her children. Santiago Reyes and his wife and his 2 boys. The Rucker twins in matching shirts that were slightly too small and apparently the source of significant grievance, judging by their expressions. Charlie Keating in the front row in the new suit his uncle had bought him from Tucson, looking more serious than any 10-year-old had any right to look, and Ruth beside him with her hand on his shoulder. Lenora wore the dress her mother had brought from Tucson, ivory cotton with a small blue ribbon at the collar, simple and well-made, and she wore her hair up with 2 pins her mother had given her that had been her grandmother's. She walked to Henry through the churchyard with her father's arm under her hand and Henry waiting at the cottonwood with the expression she loved most, the undisguised one, all the careful reserve entirely gone, just him looking at her. She thought, this is the other side of the choice. The hard side, the true side, the one that means something. This man who called me remarkable and meant it. This place where I built something real. This life I chose with clear eyes. Reverend Moss said the words and they said their words back, clearly and without performance, looking at each other the whole time. When it was finished and Henry kissed her under the cottonwood with the whole of Calder Creek watching, someone gave a whoop that was probably Cord Yates, and someone else started clapping, and Charlie Keating, who had maintained his extraordinary solemn dignity all the way through the ceremony, broke into the wide, unconstrained grin of a child who is very, very happy, and Lenora saw it from the corner of her eye and felt her heart expand past what she thought were its current limits. The supper and dancing that followed lasted until nearly midnight, which was unprecedented in the history of the Calder Creek Church social calendar, and which Margaret Hollies organized with the energy of a person who had been waiting for an occasion worthy of her full effort. Cord Yates played magnificently, and Rosa Hernandez sang twice, and Thomas Sawyer danced with Clara to a waltz that Cord played slightly too fast but with great feeling, and Santiago Reyes danced with his wife in the way of people who are entirely comfortable in each other's arms. Lenora danced with Henry until her feet hurt and then kept dancing because the night was too good to stop, and when they finally left together in the late evening, walking out from the church lights into the dark and the stars, she had her arm through his and his hand covering hers and the desert air cool and sweet around them. She said, "This is the best day of my life so far." He said, "So far." She said, "So far." He looked at her in the dark with the stars burning above them and said, "Lenora Keating." She said, "That will take some getting used to." He said, "We have time." They walked home to the ranch through the desert night, 3 miles east on the wagon road, with the lantern swinging between them and the coyotes singing somewhere to the north and the thumb standing black against the star-white sky, and she thought, this is the life. Right here. The exact life. The first year of their marriage was the fullest year of Lenora's life. She continued teaching. She had made clear before the wedding that she would, and Henry had never suggested otherwise, had in fact told her that Calder Creek needed her at that school more than it needed her to choose between being a wife and being herself, which she told him was the right answer, and she was glad he had arrived at it without coaching. The ranch absorbed her too, not as an obligation, but as a thing she genuinely wanted to understand. Henry taught her, in the patient way he did most things, the rhythms of the operation, the seasonal patterns of the cattle, the management of the water and the grass, the particular judgment calls that ranching in the high desert required. She was not afraid of the work, and Henry never acted surprised that she wasn't, which she considered one of his finest qualities. Ruth was a good companion in those first months of the marriage, steady and practical and generous with the household knowledge that Lenora was building from scratch. She had cooked a great deal for her parents, but ranch cooking at this scale was different, and Ruth showed her without condescension and received help where she needed it without pretense. Charlie turned 10 in June, and Lenora made him a birthday cake with dried apples and cinnamon, and he ate 3 pieces in a row while maintaining the dignity of a person who was not doing something excessive, which she found hilarious and said nothing about. He had grown into someone who read for pleasure now, which Henry told her was entirely her doing, and which she told Henry was entirely Charlie's doing with a little pointing in the right direction. She knew by late July that she was expecting. She told Henry on a Tuesday evening, sitting on the porch of the ranch house in the summer dark with the night birds active in the scrubland, and the stars coming out big and close overhead. She told him plainly because she told him everything plainly, and his response was to go very still for a moment and then to look at her with the full open version of his face and put his hand against her cheek and say her name in a voice that was different from his usual voice, lower, more interior, as though the word came from somewhere deeper than the everyday register. And she leaned into his hand and said, I know. He said, a child. She said, in February, I think. He said, February. He appeared to be doing arithmetic with the calendar and finding it entirely satisfactory. He said, are you well? Are you feeling all right? She said, I feel remarkable. He laughed at that, and she laughed at his laughing, and the night birds went on calling in the scrubland, and above them the stars did what Arizona Territory stars did in summer, which was burn like something alive and inexhaustible. She told her parents by letter, and her mother's reply came back in 9 days, and was the longest letter Clara Sawyer had ever written in her life, dense with advice and sentiment, and the announcement that she and Thomas intended to come in January to be present for the birth, which Lenora read aloud to Henry at supper, and which Henry received with his measured pleasure, and said that was very good news. She taught through the autumn and into December, because 12 children still needed teaching regardless of her condition, and she handled the increasing physical demands of the last months with the practical stubbornness she brought to most challenges. The children, particularly the older ones, developed a protective quality around her that she found touching and slightly funny. Sam and Eli Rucker, who had begun the year fighting in the schoolroom, were now apparently prepared to stand guardian over Miss Sawyer as though she were something breakable, which she was not, but she let them carry the firewood without debate. Her parents arrived in mid-January, and her mother set about making herself useful in the ranch kitchen, with the determination of a woman who has been waiting months for the opportunity. Her father and Henry fell into a friendship over the winter evenings that Lenora watched with a kind of quiet joy. The two of them bent over books, or talking across the supper table about education and the territory and history, finding a common ground that was also the particular pleasure of men who recognize a kindred quality of mind in the other. The baby came on the 14th of February, which was not planned but which Henry later said was so precisely on theme for Lenora that he should have seen it coming. He was a boy, healthy and substantial, and with a voice that suggested he had opinions and intended to share them, dark-haired like his father, with Lenora's eyes. They named him Daniel Thomas Keating, for Henry's brother and for her father, and when Thomas Sawyer held the child for the first time and looked down at the face carrying his name, he said nothing at all, which was the most complete expression of feeling Lenora had ever seen on his contained and careful face, and she reached up from the bed where she lay recovering and took his hand and held it and said nothing either. Charlie Keating met his new cousin with a solemnity that transitioned rapidly to fascination, because Daniel Thomas Keating at 3 days old already seemed to have a very strong personality, and Charlie, who himself had a strong personality, appeared to find this deeply interesting. He announced at supper that the baby was going to be trouble. Henry said he came honestly to that quality. Charlie looked at Lenora. Lenora kept her expression entirely neutral. Her parents stayed through March, and then returned to Tucson with the kind of satisfied hearts that come from having seen the thing you hoped for actually come true. Her father shook Henry's hand at the stage and said, quietly but clearly, that he was the finest man he had known, which Henry received with the particular embarrassed grace of a man who is not used to praise and does not know what to do with it except be grateful. Clara held Daniel Thomas for 20 minutes on the morning of the departure and handed him back to Lenora with the decisive manner of a woman cutting off something before it becomes impossible to cut, which Lenora understood and loved her for. Daniel Thomas grew into a loud, curious, crawling, then walking presence in the ranch house with an absolute conviction that all interesting things were accessible to him if he simply persisted. He was Henry's shadow from the time he could follow, toddling after his father through the barn and the corral with the focused determination of a child who considers observation and participation to be the same thing. Henry moved around him with the careful, patient attention of a man who had raised Charlie and understood that children this age are managing an enormous amount of information at once and deserve to be treated accordingly. Calder Creek grew. By 1885, 2 new families had arrived and settled, one taking up a portion of land to the north of the settlement, and one opening a small smithy that the town had badly needed. The school population grew to 17 children, and Lenora requested and received, from the informal town council, a larger schoolhouse built onto the church's other side. Henry provided the lumber, and Santiago Reyes, who had a gift for carpentry that had nothing to do with his official ranch duties, oversaw the building of it alongside 2 other men from town. The new schoolroom had 8 more desks and a second chalkboard and a bookshelf along the whole of the west wall, where the lending library had grown from 30 books to over 100, donated and collected over 3 years. The 5th anniversary of her arrival in Calder Creek fell on a September morning that was bright and clean, the early autumn air the same sharp perfection it had been when she stepped down from old Abe Talworth's wagon for the first time. She went to the schoolhouse alone that morning before the children arrived, as she often did, to prepare the day's lessons and think in the quiet. She stood at the chalkboard for a moment and looked around at the room, the desks with their various children's names scratched and smoothed, the bookshelf full of stories, the chalkboard with the week's arithmetic problem still chalked from Friday, the window with the creek visible through the cottonwoods in their early fall gold. She thought about everything she had chosen. The ring returned to Gerald Whitmore's desk, the stage north, the wagon rode east in the November dark with a lantern, the fence where Henry had held her cold hands in his warm ones and told her nothing yet but everything, the churchyard in April and her father's arm and Henry's face under the cottonwood, all the careful reserve gone, just him. She thought about what it had cost, the soft life she had set down, the comfortable house and the matched bays and the dinners with crystal glasses. She felt no grief for any of it. What she felt was the particular freedom of someone who has made the right choice and lived long enough to know it fully. She heard boots on the step and turned. Henry stood in the doorway with Daniel Thomas on his hip, the boy now 2.5 and apparently determined to accompany his father wherever he went regardless of whether it was appropriate or convenient. Henry had a look on his face like a man who had tried to leave the child at home and lost the argument without quite understanding how. She said, "What are you two doing here?" Henry said. "He heard you leave and insisted." Daniel Thomas said, with the conviction of a person whose position is self-evident, "Mama, school." She took him and settled him on the front desk with a piece of chalk and led him at the small chalkboard she had set up at his height, because Daniel Thomas's opinion on matters of inclusion was usually correct. Henry sat in his chair still after all this time, definitively his chair, and watched her finish preparing the lesson with the quality of attention she had always loved in him. He said, 5 years. She said, 5 years today. He said, "Are you happy?" She set down the chalk and turned and looked at him fully. She thought about the question with the honesty it deserved. She said, "I am more than happy, Henry. I am completely myself." He said, "That's the best possible answer." She said, "You asked a good question." He said, "I try." Daniel Thomas at the small chalkboard had written what was either the number 3 or a very enthusiastic Z, and was regarding it with evident satisfaction. Outside, the creek moved through its stones, and the cottonwoods moved their gold leaves in the morning wind, and the sky was that particular impossible blue. Ruth had remarried the previous spring, a quiet widower named James Farr who ran a small farm 2 miles west of town, and who had a gentleness that matched Ruth's own, and who treated Charlie with a warm respect that the boy had received well, having enough sense and security at this point to understand that love was not a finite thing that got used up. Charlie came to the ranch less often now, but consistently, every Sunday still, for supper, and for the kind of uncle and nephew time that had its own irreplaceable quality. He was 13 now and tall like Henry, and beginning to have the contained, serious quality that Henry had, the quality of thinking before speaking, which Lenora had watched develop in him over 4 years and considered one of her quiet professional achievements, though Charlie had done the work himself. In the late summer of 1886, Lenora realized she was expecting again. She told Henry on the porch again, same stars, same night birds, different season, and he did the same thing he had done the first time, the stillness, the open face, her name in the lower register. She said, "April this time, I think." He said, "April is a good month for things to begin." She said, "I know." They sat on the porch for a long time that evening looking out at the dark desert and talking about everything, names, and the school, and who would cover her class when she was needed at home, and whether the barn needed the new roof before winter or could wait until spring, and what Charlie had said at Sunday supper about possibly wanting to work on the ranch when he finished his schooling, and whether Daniel Thomas was going to be a handful at the school when his time came or just a productive disruption. Henry thought the latter. Lenora was less optimistic. She arranged with Margaret, who had taken on the role of the town's informal substitute teacher over the years for days when Lenora was unavailable, and with an older student named Clara Maddox, the same Clara Maddox who had arrived on the first day with her slate already out, now 13 and capable and responsible, to manage the school when needed in the spring. April of 1887 brought a daughter, Eleanor Ruth Keating, who arrived with a full head of dark hair and Lenora's jaw, and what appeared from very early to be a decisive temperament. Ruth, honored by the middle name, came to see her namesake and held her, while Henry stood at the foot of the bed and watched his wife and his daughter and his sister-in-law with the expression of a man who has been given more than he knew how to contain. And Lenora watched him watching and thought that this particular moment, this man, this room on this ranch in this high desert valley, was the answer to every question she had ever asked about what her life was for. Daniel Thomas met his sister with the formal gravity of a boy who had given the matter some thought, and decided that a sister was an acceptable development. He reported to Charlie at the following Sunday supper that Eleanor had very small hands and had grabbed his finger and would not let go for several minutes, which he described not as sweet but as very strong, which Lenora thought was the finest review a newborn had ever received. The years settled into their rhythm. The ranch grew, carefully and steadily, Henry's way. The school grew with the town, and Lenora's lending library became something people in neighboring settlements heard about and sent requests to, and she answered every one. Rosa Hernandez's sewing business thrived, and she and Lenora remained close, meeting weekly to talk and share the particular honesty they had established from the beginning. Santiago Reyes built his own small house on the eastern edge of the Keating property with Henry's blessing and his own labor, and his boys grew up alongside Daniel Thomas, and Eleanor with the easy familiarity of children who have never been taught to see difference as a reason for distance. Calder Creek became what the people of it had believed it could be when they were building it from raw desert and hope. It had a full-time reverend and a working smithy, and 2 thriving businesses owned by women and a school that had graduated children who went on to the territory's secondary institutions and came back changed by education and changed the place in turn. It had problems too, because all communities have them. The arguments about water use that required careful mediation, the winter of 1889 when 3 families lost cattle to disease and needed help to get through, the ongoing and never entirely resolved tensions around how Mexican and Apache families in the broader territory were treated, which Lenora addressed in her school as directly as she could, and pushed back against in the community as directly as she knew how. With the support of Henry and Rosa and Santiago, and others who had decided that Calder Creek could be better than the worst of its time, rather than simply typical of it. In 1890, Arizona Territory moved toward statehood, the question that Henry and Lenora had argued about in the schoolroom 8 years earlier, and they were still arguing about it, though with more information and more nuance, and the added warmth of 2 people who have learned each other's arguments as well as their own. Lenora thought statehood needed to come with better protections. Henry thought the protections needed to come first. They stayed up late on the porch debating it more than once, while inside the house, Daniel Thomas and Eleanor slept in their rooms, and the night birds called in the scrubland, and the stars burned overhead. Charlie Keating, now 17 and growing fast into the man he was going to be, came to work on the ranch on weekends and in summers with the kind of dedicated interest that Henry recognized and welcomed. He had his father Daniel's warmth and his uncle Henry's steadiness, and something all his own, a quality of observation that Lenora had noticed in him on the first day of school, the child who watched everything before he spoke. She thought he would do something interesting with his life, and she told him so, and he received it the way he received most things she said, as though it mattered. In the spring of 1891, 9 years after Lenora Sawyer had returned a ring to a mahogany desk in Tucson, and stepped out into the dry afternoon with her heart beating fast and free, she stood on the mesa above Calder Creek on a Sunday morning in April with Henry beside her and looked down at the valley below. The settlement had grown to twice its size of that first September. The church was larger. There were 2 new streets and a proper schoolhouse, separate from the church now, with her name on the dedication plaque that the town council had put up the previous year, which still embarrassed her slightly and which Henry thought was entirely appropriate. The cottonwoods by the creek were in their full spring leaf, that violent particular green, and the desert was in its brief bloom, and the sky was doing what the Arizona sky always did, which was being impossible and beautiful and enormous. Daniel Thomas, 9 years old now and increasingly his own person, was chasing Eleanor, 7, around the lower slope of the mesa with a stick and a conviction about something that Eleanor was clearly disputing at high volume. Their voices floated up to the mesa on the spring air like something you would remember later. Exactly this. the particular pitch and pitch and pitch of children in argument that was also, underneath the argument, play. Henry said, "Look at it." She said, "I'm looking." He said, "9 years." She said, "9 years." He took her hand, the same as the fence in November, the same as the church parlor in December, the same as always, certain and warm and entirely sure. She laced her fingers with his and leaned her shoulder against his arm and looked down at the valley and the settlement and the creek with its cottonwoods, and thought about the mahogany desk and the pomaded hair and the comfortable cage with its expensive bars. She thought no regrets, not a single one. Henry said, "What are you thinking about?" She said, "Gerald Whitmore." He looked at her, surprised. She said, "I am thinking that I am grateful to him in a way, because if I had not been so certain about what I did not want, I would not have been clear enough about what I did want, and I might not have known to come here." Henry said, "He did you a service by being entirely the wrong person." She laughed. "He did me an enormous service." Henry said, "I should send him a letter." She said, "Do not send him a letter." He said, "No, probably not." She looked at him. He looked at her. Below, Daniel Thomas and Eleanor had apparently resolved their dispute and were now walking up the slope toward the mesa, Eleanor holding the stick with the authority of someone who has won something. Lenora said, "Henry." He said, "Yes." She said, "You called me remarkable the first time you were really honest with me." He said, "I remember." She said, "It is still the right word." He said, "It has always been the right word." She said, "Do you know what I think?" He said, "Tell me." She said, "I think you are equally remarkable. I think this place is remarkable. I think what we have built here is remarkable. And I think that remarkable things tend to find each other eventually, if the person in question is honest enough about what they need and brave enough to go looking for it." He said, "Is that what you were doing? Going looking?" She said, "I was going running, if I'm honest." But it turned out to be the same thing. He brought her hand up and pressed his lips to the back of it, the same gesture he had when they were courting, unchanged by years, and she felt it the same way she had always felt it, new and certain and real. Daniel Thomas arrived at the top of the mesa slightly breathless and announced that Eleanor had cheated. Eleanor arrived directly behind him and announced that she had not cheated. The rules had simply not been established clearly enough in advance, and that this was a distinction that mattered. She spoke this last sentence with the particular manner of a child who has been raised in a house where distinctions that matter are given their due, and Henry's face did the thing where he was absolutely trying not to smile. Lenora looked at her daughter and said, "Eleanor, were the rules unclear before or after you wanted to do the thing the other way?" Eleanor considered this with complete seriousness. She said, "Possibly after." Lenora said, "Then what do we say?" Eleanor turned to Daniel Thomas. She said, "I am sorry I changed the rules in the middle." Daniel Thomas accepted this with the magnanimity of someone who has been vindicated. He said, "Thank you." He paused. "Then what is the mesa for? You two just come up here and look," Henry said. "Sometimes." "Yes." Daniel Thomas appeared to evaluate whether this was a satisfying answer, and then appeared to decide that it was, because he went and stood at the edge of the mesa beside his father and looked down at the valley with what appeared to be genuine interest, and Eleanor came and stood beside Lenora and took her hand without comment and looked too. They stood there, the four of them, on the flat red rock above the valley, the spring air moving over them, the settlement below alive and growing and theirs, the creek catching light in the cottonwoods, the mountains north going blue in the morning distance, the sky going on forever in every direction. Lenora looked at all of it and felt the fullness she had first found here and never lost, deeper now than it had been then, with 9 years of root beneath it. She thought, "This is the remarkable life. This specific, difficult, chosen, loved, lived-in life. Every stone of it laid by hand, every inch of it real." Henry looked sideways at her and she looked back at him, and they said nothing because they had always been good at the particular conversation that required no words, the one that simply said, "I know, I see it too, this is it, this is exactly it," and it was.